Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. Today we're going to be going over some different parts of the cerebral cortex and also how the different hemispheres of the brain kind of do different things, kind of specialize in different things. But first I want you to remember, here is the boundary between the frontal and the parietal lobes. And hopefully you remember that's a shallow groove called the central sulcus. Now just anterior to the central sulcus, in front of, you have the primary motor cortex right there. That's what initiates motor or skeletal movements. Now what you need to know is, in both the primary motor and also the primary somatosensory cortex, which is right here, just posterior to the central sulcus, the amount of area that's given for different body parts varies. So, for like the motor area, you use your hands. There's a hand, yep, got 5 fingers. You use your hands all the time. Right now I'm using my hands to make my little designs. And you got to be very precise. So hands is going to have a very, very large area in the primary motor cortex. Now other things that you don't use, they don't need quite as much precise movements, like say maybe your feet, that's going to have a smaller part of the primary motor cortex. And it's going to be the same thing with the somatosensory cortex as well. So this is kind of what I said on the last slide. What is the relationship between the size of the cortical area, or the size of the cerebral cortex, that's devoted to different body parts? Well, the size depends on the number of sensory receptors that are in that part of the body. For example, you have many sensory receptors in your lips. That's why your lips are very sensitive to touch. I mean, if the tiny little touch on your lips, you're going to feel it. Where your hips, you don't really need to feel touch on your hips as much. So there's going to be a larger area of the cerebral cortex devoted to the lips than the hips. And now this crazy little guy is a representation of how much of your cerebral cortex, your primary somatosensory cortex, is related to different parts of the body. So it's pretty easy to figure out how this guy works. The larger the body part, the larger area of the somatosensory cortex is dedicated to that body part. And that makes sense. Your hands are very large in this guy because you need your hands to feel things. Whenever you want to feel an object to see what it feels like, you use your hands. You don't use your arms. Although, you do feel things with your arms as well, you don't have nearly the same amount of sensory receptors as you do on your hands or on your lips, mouth, and tongue. And this is basically the same thing, except now we're not talking about the primary somatosensory cortex. We're going to be talking about the primary motor cortex, which deals with movement. And you're going to have the same looking guy here on the next slide, and it's going to show you which part of the primary motor cortex, how much of it, how large of regions are dedicated to different body parts. And you can probably see things like the thumb and the fingers. It's going to be a large part of the primary motor cortex because these require precise movements. So as I'm writing this, if I'm going to write my name or sign my name, that takes precise movements. I could not do that with my feet. So, any parts of your body that needs really precise movements, that's going to have a large area of the primary motor cortex. And here is the motor homunculus. Once again, huge hands, even bigger. It's got to have precise movement with the hands. Also very large again with the mouth and lips. Your legs, you don't need precise, you're not making precise movements with your legs or your feet. Also, you can see the eyes are pretty large because you need to have very, very precise movements with the eyes. And kind of a different type of homunculus. So over here we have the sensory homunculus. So this would be the cerebrum after it's been cut with a coronal or frontal section. And you can see how big the regions are of the primary somatosensory cortex is devoted to each body part, and you can also see where they're located. You're not going to have to know this, but you should know Lips and mouth, very large. Also the hands and fingers, very large in the somatosensory cortex. There's a very large area of that part of the brain that's devoted to those regions. And now other things like your hip and your legs, there's a smaller region of the primary somatosensory cortex because you do not have as many sensory receptors there. Same thing over here with the motor homunculus. So this would be the primary motor cortex, looking at it from a frontal section. Once again, very large area of the primary motor cortex has to do with the mouth, the face, the eyes. Also, once again, look how big of the motor cortex is devoted just for your hands, because these guys need precise movements. Things that don't need as precise movements, like the hips, have a very, very small portion of the primary motor cortex. And now it's time for a brain break. So here's your riddle of the day. Poor people have it, rich people need it. If you eat it, you die. What is it? See if you can figure it out. And the answer, of course, is nothing. Hemispheric lateralization. That is just a way of saying that each different hemispheres of the brain kind of specializes in different things. So we already heard that the left side of our brain specializes in language, producing speech, and also comprehending speech. Now, the differences, so in men, each side of the brain is more specialized, so they're kind of like more different from each other, where in the female brain, there doesn't seem to be as big a difference between the left and the right hemispheres. Also, females seem to have larger connections. So basically, their left and right hemispheres seem to work together a little better. So, and remember, it's the corpus callosum which connects both the left and right hemispheres together. And here are some things that the different hemispheres of the brain kind of specialize in. You've probably heard it before. Maybe you have, where they say either you're left-brained or you're right-brained. They say your left is more analytical and like science and math, where your right side of your brain is more artistic. So this is some of the things. So we remember spoken and written language. So language, left side of the brain. Numerical and scientific skills. So there's the math and science. Ability to understand and use sign language. Definitely write these down because I did see a couple questions on this. And also like logical reasoning. So those are all left side of the brain. That's all left brain stuff. Now on your right side, musical and artistic awareness. So this is the artistic side. Space and pattern perception. I think this one might be on your test. Recognition of faces and emotional content of facial expressions. So if part of your right hemisphere is damaged, sometimes you will not be able to recognize people, you won't be able to recognize faces or recognize facial expressions. So even if someone had the biggest smile on their face and you asked them, is that person happy or sad? They would be like, I don't know, how can I tell? That's because the right side of the brain is what recognizes facial expressions. Also generating emotional content of language. So another thing of, is this person mad when they're talking to me, or are they happy with me? And last, generating mental images to compare spatial relationships. So these are things that the right and left hemispheres specialize in. And now on to memory. Of course, memory is the ability to recall information or recall thoughts. First, learning the information or your thoughts have to be stored into memory. And then if it does get stored into memory, later, hopefully like during a test, that information can be retrieved. Now, which parts of the brain are involved in memory? Well, the association areas of all four lobes of the brain are involved in memory. Parts of the limbic system, especially the hippocampus, are crucial for storing new memories. So remember, if your hippocampus gets damaged, you remember everything from your past, but you're unable to learn anything new. And also areas of the diencephalon like the thalamus and hypothalamus are also important in storing new memories. Now, all learning is, in order for a thought to become part of memory or information to be stored in memory, there's a change in the nervous system. Remember, you do not grow new neurons, but your existing neurons can form bridges or form synapses with new neurons. And that's all learning is. It's your existing neurons in your brain forming new connections with other neurons. Now, learning and memory is not completely understood, even by the best neurologists and neuroscientists there are, so it's certainly not completely understood by me. But you have what's called short-term memory. This lasts, it says seconds or hours. I'm going to cross out hours. It lasts up to about 30 seconds. 30 seconds without rehearsal. So if somebody gives you their phone number, if you're not rehearsing like 555-3785, 555-3785, you will lose that information within 30 seconds. Now, if you rehearse it, you can keep that memory in your brain longer until you can write it down. But you can only store bits of information, and it's usually around 7 bits. So if I gave you a list of 7 words to remember, in short-term memory, you could only remember about 7. If you can remember more than 7, you're above average. Less than 7, you'd be below average. I don't know what I am. I've never actually tried it. Now, if something gets stored into what's called long-term memory, now it's going to last for days to years to even forever. And of course, this is what students sometimes struggle with. The process of turning short-term memories into long-term memories. Now, what you need to remember about that, not for this test, but maybe for studying or something, remember, the more you practice information, the more you're going to change your nervous system. The stronger those connections are going to become between the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of another. So the more you practice, the more you study, the stronger that memory will be in your long-term memory. And it'll be much more easy to retrieve or recall that information when you're taking a test. EEG, or electroencephalogram. These are recordings of brain waves. So they stick a lot of these electrodes on your scalp, and what they're doing is they're reading the action potentials of millions and millions of nerves inside your cerebral cortex. Now, depending on what the activity is you're doing, you will get different, what's called waves. So you'll get a different readout on the EEG machine, depending on what you're doing. Now, this is used to measure brain function and also diagnose different brain disorders like epilepsy, also some sleep disorders, and they also do it in sleep studies because these different waves happen at different times of the night. And so if someone was reading your EEG, they could tell whether you're dreaming, whether you're in deep sleep, or whether you're awake. And a little more about the electroencephalogram. I'm going to go over this pretty quick because I don't think it's on your test, but as far as brain death goes, or being brain dead, what's going to happen is they test you twice, 24 hours apart, and if there's an absence or no EEG activity in both of them, the person could be declared brain dead. And now what some of these waves are, so like the alpha waves, that is when you are awake, but you are usually fairly relaxed. Beta waves is like when you're really doing a task that you're involved with, so you're really thinking. So if you're doing some project at school, that would be beta waves. Now, once you're done with that project and you kind of take a deep breath, then you'll see an increase of alpha waves. Theta waves do a couple things. Emotional stress, so the hormones that are released during stress tend to be associated with theta waves. But theta waves are also, if you're hypnotized and you're really open to suggestions, or if you're really, really relaxed, you can start to see theta waves. Those also start to appear when you're going to sleep. So those will be the first waves that will appear when you fall asleep. And when you're in really, really deep sleep, that's when you get the slowest frequency of waves, and those are the delta waves. And here's a guy, not the clearest picture in the world, but he's having an electroencephalogram or EEG performed on him. So you can see all the little electrodes that are placed on his scalp and his forehead. And those are measuring the amount of action potentials that are going on in his cerebrum with all the neurons. And these things can be tested to test for things like brain tumors, although there's way better ways to do it than an EEG. A cerebral infarction, that's where like a myocardial infarction is a heart attack where your heart doesn't get blood. Well, this is where your brain doesn't get blood. Drug or alcohol abuse, encephalitis, which is your brain being basically inflamed. And also things like seizures and definitely sleep disorders such as narcolepsy. That's when you'll be awake and then all of a sudden, boom, you just fall asleep when you're not even trying to fall asleep. Some people have actually, this has happened to them while they're driving. So without medication, people that are narcoleptic usually aren't allowed to drive. All right, that is it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.